A tiny German Shepherd puppy slipped into a silent hospital hallway, shivering and alone. No one knew how it got inside. Behind a half-closed door, a Navy SEAL lay in a coma, forgotten by time, his heartbeat fading after years of war. Doctors had surrendered hope until the pup climbed onto his chest. One tiny paw, one impossible heartbeat, a miracle no science could explain. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. A quiet winter morning settled over the outskirts of a small Alaskan town where the mountains held the last echo of dawn. Ethan Walker stepped out of the rehabilitation center with a stiffness that came less from the cold and more from a long season of internal frost. He had been attending PTSD therapy for months, yet the sessions felt like digging through frozen ground with bare hands. His mind still moved through old battlefields as if they were obligations he couldn't abandon. Every flash of memory came with the same weight: 3 men lost, 1 man left behind, and a silence he could never fully break. Ethan was 38, a former Navy SEAL whose psyche had been worn thin by survival. The instructors once called him the kind of soldier who held out when others fell. Now he was a man who held himself together only by routine. Wake, breathe, survive, repeat. The military had taught him how to endure pain, but no one had taught him how to outlive guilt. His therapist, Dr. Myers, gentle but firm, often said healing required opening doors he had welded shut. Ethan disagreed. Doors kept things in place. Breaking them would free ghosts he'd rather leave locked. Still, Dr. Myers insisted he try something outside the clinical frame, a form of spiritual grounding recommended by the local community. He had handed Ethan a slip of paper with a name and a location written in shaky ink: Anira, keeper of the forest's quiet places. Ethan didn't believe in mystics, but he had reached that stage of exhaustion where refusal cost more energy than acceptance. So he walked. The path led deep into a wooded area, half buried in frost. At its end stood a wooden cabin sagging with age, its walls stained by storms and time. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and for a moment Ethan felt as though he had stepped out of the world and into a memory not his own. When he knocked, the door opened slowly, revealing a dim interior lit by a scattered arrangement of candles that flickered like restless thoughts. Inside, a woman sat at a heavy wooden table carved with unusual markings, symbols looping and intersecting like the remnants of an ancient dialect. She was older, her presence steady, but strangely piercing, as if she listened to more than words. This was Anira. She did not rise or gesture for him to sit. She simply watched him until he felt the weight of her attention settle on the parts of him he usually hid. "You carry fractures that did not begin in war," she said softly, her voice a whisper that seemed woven through the air. War only reveals what was already wounded. Ethan had no response. People had spoken to him about trauma before, but this woman's tone felt less like explanation and more like recognition. Anira placed her hand gently over the carved symbols before her. "There is a path for you," she murmured. "But it does not lie in clinics or in forgetting. It begins with a companion waiting at the place where the first light touches the earth." Ethan frowned. "I don't—" "You have been living in the half-shadow of who you were," she interrupted. "Go toward the sunrise. Go tomorrow before the world fully wakes. A small life is calling to you, and you must answer." Her certainty unsettled him. Ethan had never considered fate anything more than a poetic excuse people used to explain pain. But standing in the dim light of that cabin, listening to the way her words wrapped themselves around him, he felt something unfamiliar. Not belief, but the awareness of possibility. She did not dismiss him. She did not explain further. She only added, "Some bonds are older than this life. Some meetings were agreed upon long before breath." When Ethan stepped back outside, the morning had sharpened into bright cold, the kind that cut but also cleared the mind. He walked the trail again, replaying her voice in the hollow place behind his ribs. A companion waiting, a small life calling. He told himself it was nonsense, yet part of him, a part he had starved for years, leaned toward the idea that he was being asked to move again, not by duty, but by something gentler. The next day, he woke before sunrise. Not from nightmares for once, but from a quiet insistence he could not shake. He followed the light as it stretched across the frozen ground, leading him through town toward a small storefront he had rarely noticed before. Its sign read, "Bright Paw Shelter." The name felt almost too on the nose, but he continued inside. The interior was warm, filled with soft whimpers and the shifting sounds of small paws. A shelter worker, a young man who introduced himself as Daniel, greeted Ethan politely, but with visible curiosity. Men dressed like him seldom visited. "Can I help you find a dog?" Daniel asked. "Not exactly," Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure if that was true. He wandered through the room until a faint rustle drew his attention. Near the back was a small enclosure, noticeably separated from the others. Inside sat a very tiny German shepherd puppy, scarcely larger than Ethan's palm. The pup did not bark, did not whine, did not retreat. It simply looked up at him with a quiet, steady awareness, as though it recognized something in him. Ethan crouched slowly, unsure why his breath had caught in his throat. The puppy took one small, uncertain step toward him, then another, until it pressed a tiny paw against the barrier. Not assertive, not fearful, just present, like a heartbeat saying, "I know you." Daniel approached with a surprised expression. "That one. He doesn't usually come close to anyone. He's been withdrawn since we found him. Cold night, abandoned box, long story." But Ethan barely heard. The moment his hand touched the edge of the enclosure, the puppy leaned forward and rested its head against his fingers. A soft warmth spread through Ethan's chest, something loosening, unfurling. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't miraculous. It was simply real. A thought flickered through him. Some bonds are older than this life. When he lifted the puppy into his arms, the small body relaxed against him, as though returning to a place it had long expected to find. He held the pup carefully, feeling an unexpected but unmistakable thread connecting them. "I'll take him," Ethan said quietly. Daniel nodded, almost relieved, as if watching something fall into alignment. Ethan stepped outside with the tiny pup pressed against him. The sun had just risen, bathing the street in gold. Anira's words returned to him like an echo wrapped in warmth. "Go where the first light touches the earth." And for the first time in years, Ethan felt he had stepped toward, not away from, himself. Snowfall drifted quietly across the lower valley as Ethan Walker left the shelter with the tiny German shepherd tucked inside his jacket, the warmth of the small creature pulsing gently against his chest. Dawn had risen in pale bands of light, soft and uncertain, and the world seemed quieter than usual, as though something unseen had paused to watch him take this first step with Aster. The puppy, barely larger than a man's hand, stayed pressed close, not from fear alone, but from something that felt almost like trust. Ethan had never expected a connection so immediate, yet it seemed as natural as drawing breath. By midday, he and Aster were hiking the ridge near his cabin, following the path prescribed by his physical therapist as part of his recovery routine. It was meant to improve mobility and grounding, though Ethan always felt it tested more of his mind than his body. Today, however, the trail felt different. Every few minutes, Aster would peer up at him as if confirming he was still present, still tethered to something living rather than to memory. Ethan found himself responding to those glances with a quiet steadiness that surprised him. The ridge had long been familiar, yet the landscape carried its own risks. Snowstorms could rise fast, unpredictable, especially this time of year. Still, he moved forward, driven by the need to keep his mind from slipping. Aster followed his pace easily, though the puppy's steps were tiny compared to Ethan's long strides. The little dog paused once to sniff the wind, tilting his head as though noticing something beyond human perception. Ethan made a mental note of it. He had always trusted animals more than his own instincts during deployment. Perhaps that old habit remained. Halfway across the mountain trail, a distant sound cut through the stillness, a faint cry fractured by the wind. Ethan froze. It did not belong to any animal he recognized, nor was it the groan of shifting ice. It was human. Before he could question it, Aster let out a soft but alarmed whine and tugged at his pant leg, urging him forward. The cry came again, sharper now. Ethan's training took over, instincts aligning with the precision of his former life. He moved toward the sound with controlled urgency, Aster darting ahead in quick, short bursts. They found her wedged between two jagged rocks on the hillside, half buried under drifted snow. A woman, conscious only by a thin thread, gasping as though each breath was borrowed. Her leg appeared twisted beneath her, pinned by the uneven stone. Her clothing was torn in places where the sharp rocks had scraped her during the fall. She blinked slowly, aware but fading. "Help?" she managed. Ethan knelt beside her, quickly assessing the situation. The fall had been recent but severe. She must have slipped from the upper trail. Her pulse trembled beneath his fingers. He asked her name, and she whispered, "Lena." That single word revealed little, but he sensed that she had been hiking alone for reasons she did not want to share. The weary kind of bravery in her voice hinted at past burdens, perhaps a history of pushing through hardship alone. Snow thickened around them, and the sky darkened with the warning signs of an approaching storm. Ethan knew they had limited time. He freed her leg with practiced care and stabilized her position as best as possible, but the storm was descending too quickly to risk a slow evacuation back up the ridge. He made a decision rooted in instinct and training. He would carry her. Aster circled anxiously as Ethan lifted Lena onto his back. She was light, but the terrain ahead was treacherous, and visibility continued to fall. Snow whipped sideways now, grains of ice stinging exposed skin. The temperature dropped sharply, biting through layers. Ethan pushed forward, adjusting his balance with every step. Aster stayed by his heel, unyielding despite the worsening storm. The ridge grew unstable beneath them. Wind roared across the mountainside with a force that rattled even Ethan's seasoned composure. One gust struck with enough power to make him stagger. Another followed. He lowered his center of gravity, but the ice shifted underfoot, faster than he could recover. The snow beneath him cracked. Aster barked sharply, but there was no time to react. The ground gave way. All three plunged down the slope. The world swallowed into white chaos. Ethan twisted his body mid-fall, muscle memory dictating every movement. He curled protectively around Lena to shield her from the jagged ice, tucking Aster as close as possible with his free arm. Impact came hard. Pain burst through him, but he held Lena securely until the momentum slowed and the avalanche of loose snow settled. Aster slid to his side, shivering yet conscious. He scrambled weakly toward Ethan, nudging him with frantic determination. Ethan tried to rise, but darkness surged at the edges of his vision. Lena's faint voice reached him, choked by fear and cold. "Please, don't—" He wanted to answer, but the weight of the fall dragged him under. His last sight before unconsciousness took him was Aster's tiny silhouette standing over him, trembling yet unmoving, as if preparing to guard both injured humans against a world that had suddenly turned hostile. The storm intensified, swallowing the mountainside. In that blinding white chaos, only one creature remained conscious, a small, fragile life with a heart far braver than its size. And Aster had already made his decision. He would not let the darkness take them. Not today. Not while he still had strength to move. As the wind howled and snow deepened, the puppy turned toward the ridge above, eyes narrowing with instinctive resolve, preparing to do the impossible. He would find help, no matter the cost. And far above the storm, in the deep place between fate and instinct, something ancient stirred, watching the tiny shepherd rise against the winter. Wind carved wild paths through the mountains as the storm tightened its grip, swallowing the ridge and erasing every trace of the fall. Night had not yet come, but the sky above the valley dimmed into a bruised gray, thick with snow that moved like a living veil. At the base of the narrow slope, where jagged stone met drifting ice, Ethan Walker and Lena lay motionless, two wounded figures suspended between breath and oblivion. Only one small life remained awake: Aster. The tiny German shepherd pup trembled uncontrollably from the cold, but something beyond instinct anchored him to this moment. His small heart beat with frantic clarity, a drum of fear and devotion. He nudged Ethan's shoulder first, whimpering at the lifeless heaviness beneath his paw. No response. He turned to Lena, nudged her gloved hand, and received only a weak twitch. Everything in the puppy's trembling body told him to curl beside them for warmth and surrender to the storm. Yet something deeper, something he didn't understand but couldn't ignore, pulled him upward. The ridge above was steep and unstable, but Aster had already made his decision. He turned toward the slope with the unsteady bravery of a creature who had never been taught the meaning of impossible. Snow beat against his face, but he pushed forward. His legs slipped often, and more than once he tumbled back down a few feet, yet he rose each time, driven by the memory of Ethan's heartbeat against his small body, by the strange knowing that the man was his, and he was the man's. The world had given him few memories, but Ethan was already its brightest one. Aster climbed, higher, higher. The storm screamed like a beast, drowning the valley in white. After nearly 20 minutes of struggling upward, he stumbled onto a section of the trail where the ground leveled and visibility opened just enough to reveal a distant shape flickering through the snowfall. It was a lantern, moving. Aster's small body surged with energy. Someone was out here. Aster sprinted toward the light, yelping with all the force his tiny lungs could muster. The sound barely carried in the wind, but luck, fate perhaps, favored him. The lantern stopped. A figure turned. Aster barked again, louder this time, a desperate, breaking sound that tugged through the storm like a thread. The figure stepped closer. It was a man, broad-shouldered beneath heavy winter gear, weathered not by age alone, but by years spent surviving the land rather than fighting it. His name was Caleb Rowan, a local hunter known for traversing the mountains during harsh storms to check on trapped wildlife and abandoned camps. Caleb had experienced tragedy once in these same mountains, a friend lost during a blizzard rescue that came too late, and since then he had walked these ridges whenever storms rose, compelled not by duty, but by a personal vow never to ignore a cry for help. He knelt when he reached Aster, confusion sweeping across his features. "Where did you come from, little one?" he murmured, his voice steady even under the storm's roar. Aster pushed against him, then darted away, looking back urgently. He repeated this twice until understanding dawned. "You want me to follow you?" Caleb tightened his coat and lifted the lantern. "All right then, lead on." The tiny puppy did not waste a second. He turned and raced back down the trail, Caleb close behind, slipping and gripping the mountainside with practiced experience. Aster's paws left the faintest prints, but they were enough. Minutes later, Caleb reached the slope where the snow had collapsed. His breath froze when he saw them. Ethan lying half-buried, Lena collapsed beside him. "God," Caleb whispered, rushing forward. He checked their pulses, faint but present, ethereal like candles near extinguishing. He immediately radioed his emergency contact, voice tight but controlled. "2 unconscious adults, severe hypothermia. I need rescue teams and a stretcher. Location marker 12B, ridge break." He wrapped both survivors in his thermal blankets, keeping his hands steady, though his stomach clenched with urgency. He recognized Ethan by name. Most people in town did, though few claimed to know him. They called him the ghost veteran who moved through the valley like someone searching for a doorway back into life. Caleb had always meant to speak to him someday, but fate was faster. Astor pressed against Ethan's side, whining softly, as if insisting that the man understand he was not alone. Caleb gently patted the pup. "You did good. You did real good." Within 20 minutes, that felt much longer, the rescue team arrived, carrying insulated stretchers and emergency heat packs. Marla Jennings, the paramedic leading the team, assessed Ethan with professional clarity. She was known for her level-headedness during mountain emergencies, shaped by the loss of her brother in a winter accident years earlier. Marla carried that grief quietly, letting it sharpen her instincts rather than break her. "Pulse weak, breathing shallow. Let's get him and the woman stabilized. Move fast, but move clean," she said. Astor cried out each time they lifted Ethan, attempting to climb into the stretcher until Caleb scooped the puppy into his arms. "He's coming with us," Caleb told the team. No one argued. The world blurred after that. Sleds sliding across ice, paramedics shouting vitals, headlamps turning the whiteout into a surreal tunnel. Astor remained awake through it all, refusing to rest, refusing to blink for too long, as if afraid Ethan might disappear if he looked away. At the base station, both patients were transferred to the emergency vehicle. Lena was slipping in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragmented pleas that revealed little but fear. Fear not for herself, but for Ethan. The doors closed and the engine roared forward toward the hospital. Astor sat in Caleb's lap, trembling but refusing to leave the window. His gaze fixed on the ambulance ahead, tiny chest rising and falling with anxious devotion. In that moment, no one needed to teach the puppy loyalty. It was already carved into him like instinct older than memory. As they drove into the storm's thinning edge, Caleb exhaled, glancing at Astor with quiet awe. "You found me," he whispered. "You saved them." Astor didn't understand the words, but he felt the tone. He leaned forward, eyes reflecting the ambulance lights disappearing into the dark horizon like a fragile thread of hope. And somewhere inside that emergency vehicle, Ethan's pulse flickered faintly, slowing, fighting, slipping toward the quiet where voices fade. Yet Astor refused to look away, refused to yield to the storm or the silence. Something deep within him knew this was only the beginning. The hospital lights glowed dimly against the storm-thickened afternoon, their pale shimmer trembling on the frosted windows like breaths caught between hope and despair. Inside the emergency wing, the air felt too still, as if even the building understood the fragile boundary between survival and loss. Ethan Walker was wheeled into the trauma bay first, his body rigid with cold, pulse-thready beneath layers of warming blankets. Lena followed moments later, drifting in and out of consciousness, whispering fragments of fear that dissolved before anyone could decipher them. Astor arrived last, carried in Caleb Rowan's arms, his tiny frame shaking with exhaustion, yet refusing to collapse. Everything he'd done on that mountain was beyond instinct. It was devotion carved from something older than memory. When Caleb attempted to hand him off to a nurse, Astor let out a soft, broken whine and dug his paws into the man's coat. The sound caught the attention of Dr. Harris, the attending physician, who stepped forward with a calm but strained expression. He was a man shaped by years of mountain emergencies and quiet nights spent fighting outcomes he could not always change. The lines on his face revealed both skill and the fatigue of witnessing too many battlefields inside hospital walls. "Let him stay a moment," Dr. Harris said. "Dogs like this, they don't leave for no reason." Astor seemed to understand, settling onto the blanket laid beside the trauma bed while the medical team surrounded Ethan. Machines beeped with mechanical steadiness. Warm saline flowed into chilled veins. Heat masks pushed humid air into lungs that struggled to rise. Yet nothing changed. Ethan's body had fallen into a deep, unresponsive stillness. Dr. Harris watched the monitor with tightening concern. "He's not stabilizing," he murmured to Marla Jennings, who stood nearby after transferring the rescue report. "Vitals are stagnant. If his core temperature doesn't rise soon—" He didn't finish. Marla knew the implication. She'd seen it before, the moment a body hesitated between returning and letting go. Meanwhile, Astor curled beside the trauma bed, refusing to blink. His gaze fixed on Ethan with an intensity far beyond his small size. Nurses stepped around him carefully, whispering about how unusual it was for such a tiny pup to survive a storm, let alone lead a rescue. Caleb remained in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes troubled. He muttered softly, "If that little one made it through the blizzard, the man better not give up on him now." Hours passed. Evening settled. Lena regained partial consciousness in the adjacent room, calling out Ethan's name with a tremor of fear and guilt. She appeared to understand, even in her haze, that he had shielded her with more than instinct. He had shielded her with a lifetime of training and a heart too accustomed to sacrifice. Dr. Harris visited her briefly, confirmed her injuries were treatable, then returned to Ethan's bedside with a heaviness in his step. "He's slipping further," he said to the nurse beside him. "We may lose him before morning." Astor whimpered, a sound so soft that it seemed like it had traveled from a deeper place within him. But when Ethan still did not move, the pup rose shakily to his feet. He placed both tiny paws on the blanket near Ethan's hand. No one stopped him. Marla watched with folded arms, her brow furrowing with an odd tension. Caleb stepped closer. Dr. Harris kept still, unsure whether to intervene or to allow the animal's presence to run its course. Astor leaned forward, gently resting his forehead against Ethan's unmoving palm. A moment of silence stretched across the room, thin and trembling. Then something on the monitor shifted. A blip, small but unmistakable. Dr. Harris blinked. "Again," he whispered, leaning in. Another blip, then another, not strong but different. Astor stayed against Ethan's hand, eyes half closed, as if concentrating with all the strength left in his tiny body. Ethan's breathing deepened by barely a fraction, but it was enough to ignite movement across the room. "Temperature is rising by 0.1, the nurse said with disbelief. "Cardiac rhythm stabilizing." "It's impossible," Marla murmured. "That pup," Caleb finished the sentence for her, "is bringing him back." Dr. Harris lifted his hand, unable to explain it scientifically, but unwilling to deny what he saw. "Let him stay. No one moves him." Astor continued pressing against Ethan until exhaustion overtook him. His body finally slumped at the edge of the pillow, but his paw remained touching Ethan's wrist as though bound by invisible thread. Minutes later, Ethan's eyelids flickered. The room froze. Machines beeped steadily. A weak breath pushed through Ethan's chest, then another, deeper. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening as awareness struggled through the haze. The first thing he saw was the small shape beside him, the tiny pup curled against his arm. His voice rasped as he exhaled a fractured whisper. "Astor!" Dr. Harris stepped forward quickly. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Ethan blinked again. He didn't respond to the doctor immediately. Instead, he rested his hand on the pup, feeling warmth where cold had nearly claimed him. Something in his gaze softened, a hint of recognition, gratitude, and a fragile will returning to life. Marla released a shaky breath. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, as though a weight had eased inside him. But the reprieve lasted only moments. Ethan's voice came faint, barely shaped. "Lena? Where?" His sentence trailed off into weakness. Dr. Harris answered gently. "She's alive, stabilizing, thanks to your actions." Ethan tried to sit up, failed, and sank back. His hand tightened minutely around Astor. "Don't leave him alone," he murmured before consciousness slipped again, into a calmer state, no longer the edge of death, but not yet true rest. Dr. Harris observed the monitors. "He's improving, slowly, but he's not safe yet." Astor lifted his head with weary determination, as though hearing the unspoken implication. The pup crawled closer and pressed himself fully against Ethan's side. And in that moment, as the storm began to ease outside the hospital walls, a question rose silently in the minds of everyone present. If the smallest life could bring Ethan back once, what would he need to survive what came next? Morning crept into the hospital in a muted gray, the kind that arrived quietly, unsure if it should bring hope or hesitation. Snow still clung to the edges of the window panes, but the storm had passed, leaving behind the exhausted calm that follows a battle neither side truly won. Ethan Walker lay in a private recovery room now, no longer cold, no longer fading, yet suspended in the fragile stillness between waking and healing. Machines hummed with softened tones. His breathing had steadied. His pulse carried more weight. But the internal war, the one no monitor could measure, still held him in its silent grip. Astor slept curled against Ethan's hip, his tiny body rising and falling with the rhythm of his human's breath. He had not left the bedside once, not even when nurses came to change IV lines or adjust the monitors. They worked around him, respecting the strange and undeniable influence he held over Ethan's recovery. Word of the miracle had already begun spreading through the hospital, whispered between staff who had seen too many battles lost to ignore a battle unexpectedly won. But for Astor, none of that mattered. His world was small, defined not by walls or machines, but by the warmth beneath him, the heartbeat he had fought a storm to protect. In the adjacent wing, Lena woke fully for the first time. Her leg was stabilized, her breathing strong, but her expression carried an unsettled tension, a guilt she had not yet named. She remembered the fall, the moment Ethan shielded her with his own body. She remembered trying to warn him, her voice lost in the blizzard. And she remembered the sound of something tiny barking in the storm as darkness swallowed her. A nurse entered and smiled gently. "You're lucky the rescue team found you quickly." "They didn't find us," Lena whispered. Something led them. When she asked for Ethan's condition, the nurse hesitated, not wanting to raise or crush hope. "He's stable for now, but he was close, too close." Lena closed her eyes. A storm had nearly taken her life, and the man who saved her was still fighting in the aftermath. A quiet determination rose through her chest. She needed to see him, but she needed permission first. Meanwhile, Dr. Harris stepped into Ethan's room, holding a clipboard as though it grounded him amid the day's unusual events. His years in emergency medicine had taught him caution, discipline, realism. Yet even he had spent the early hours replaying the moment Ethan's vitals surged when the pup touched him. He approached the bed slowly. "Ethan," he said, though he knew the man was still drifting in partial sleep. "You're not in danger anymore, but you're not out of the woods either." Ethan stirred faintly. It wasn't consciousness, it was resistance, as though part of him feared leaving the dark where memories stayed contained. Dr. Harris leaned closer. "You fought too hard to disappear now, and you're not fighting alone this time." As if understanding, Astor opened his eyes. The puppy pressed closer to Ethan, lifting his head with quiet resolve. Harris exhaled, lowering his clipboard. "It's strange," he admitted to the small creature. But I've learned to stop questioning miracles that work. A knock sounded at the door. Caleb Rowan entered, the mountain hunter carrying an unspoken weight in his steps. In the bright light, he looked more tired than when he'd trudged through a storm. He stared at Ethan with a mixture of relief and solemnity. "Thought he'd be gone when we pulled him out," Caleb murmured. "Didn't think he'd make it through the ride." Dr. Harris nodded. "He made it because of that puppy." Caleb crouched beside Astor. "Little warrior," he whispered, stroking the pup's head. "Storms shouldn't make heroes out of the smallest ones, but sometimes they do." Astor lifted his chin as if agreeing. The room fell into a contemplative quiet until Lena appeared at the doorway, leaning on crutches. She looked fragile, but her voice held no hesitation. "Is he awake?" Harris shook his head gently. "He's drifting, but not fully conscious. Your presence might help, but only for a short time." Lena crossed the room slowly, pausing at the foot of Ethan's bed. Seeing him like this, strong yet vulnerable, pulled something tight within her. "This man saved my life," she said quietly. "He didn't even think. He just acted." She looked toward Astor. "And you saved both of us." Astor wagged his tail once but didn't move. Lena gripped the bed railing with trembling fingers. "I owe him more than I can repay." Dr. Harris studied her carefully. "What do you do, Lena?" "I'm a behavioral psychologist," she answered. "I work with trauma patients." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Then you understand more than most what he's going through." "Yes," she whispered. "And I also understand that surviving the fall is only one part of the recovery. What comes after can be worse." Dr. Harris nodded with hesitant hope. "When he wakes, he'll need someone who can guide him through the storm he carries inside." "Then I'll stay," Lena said simply, "as long as he needs." Sometime that afternoon, as the gray light softened into white, Ethan stirred again. Real movement this time. Astor perked up instantly. His tiny paws pressed gently against Ethan's chest. Ethan's eyelids lifted, slow, heavy, but present. He looked at the ceiling first, confused. Then he shifted slightly as Lena stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Ethan, you're safe." He blinked, turning toward the sound. Confusion flickered into recognition, and then relief. "Lena? You're alive?" She nodded, holding back emotion. "Because of you." His gaze drifted downward. Astor stood firmly against him, tail quivering in joy. Ethan's voice cracked as he whispered, "You again, little star?" Astor answered by nudging his chin against Ethan's arm. Something in Ethan's expression broke open quietly. Not pain, not fear, but the first breath of some long-buried softness returning to life. Yet beneath that warmth, a question formed in Ethan's eyes. "How long was I out?" he asked. Dr. Harris stepped forward. "A day and a half. Your vitals crashed once. The pup brought them back." Ethan frowned faintly. "I don't remember anything after the fall." Lena exchanged a glance with Harris. "The mind protects itself," she said. "You've been carrying too much for too long." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, as if wrestling with memories waiting to surface. Astor pressed closer to him, sensing the shift in the man's breath. When Ethan opened his eyes again, something darker moved behind them, an old shadow stirred by returning consciousness. He swallowed hard. "Before I blacked out, I heard something, or someone." Caleb leaned in. "Heard what?" Ethan's voice lowered. A voice. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the storm. The room stilled. Lena took a small step forward. "What did it say, Ethan?" He hesitated, his fingers curled faintly against the blanket. "It said, 'He's not done.'" Astor stiffened beside him, ears lifting, the air shifting as though the small pup sensed something approaching. something that had nothing to do with cold or injury. Ethan turned his gaze toward the window, where wind whispered along the edges of the glass. And for reasons none of them could yet explain, fear flickered in his eyes, not from the storm he'd survived, but from the storm that still waited inside him. There are moments in life when what saves us is not strength, not skill, not even our own will to survive, but something quieter, something placed gently into our path by hands we cannot see. Ethan Walker believed he had reached the end of his strength, that the storms inside him would never break. Yet God sent him a miracle wrapped in the smallest form, a tiny German Shepherd puppy whose courage outweighed his size, whose loyalty carried more power than any weapon Ethan had ever held. Sometimes God does not speak through thunder or burning skies. Sometimes He whispers through a soft heartbeat pressed against our chest. Sometimes He answers us with companionship when we thought we deserved loneliness. Sometimes He mends us with love when we believed we were beyond repair. Astor was not just a dog. He was a reminder that grace arrives exactly when our hands are too tired to reach for it. He was proof that even in the coldest winter of life, of spirit, of the heart, God's warmth can still break through. And like Ethan, each of us walks through storms invisible to others. Grief that lingers, memories that ache, burdened days that feel too heavy to carry alone. But miracles are not rare. They simply come softly. They come in people we meet by chance, in small acts of kindness, in the way God sends help before we know how to ask for it. If you are watching this today, may Ethan's story remind you of one truth. You are not forgotten. God has not stopped writing your story, and He can use even the smallest light to guide you home.